The rain outside Precinct 7 was a relentless, icy drumming, the kind that swallowed sound and made the fluorescent lights inside seem sickly and weak. Detective Elias Thorne, a man whose face carried the permanent shadows of 5 years on the Major Crimes Unit, was the only one in the bullpen. His partner, Detective Ramirez, was on a much-deserved vacation, leaving Thorne to babysit the graveyard shift. Thorne was hunched over a cold cup of coffee, staring at the corkboard dedicated to the Whisper Killer case. 3 victims in 6 months. All strangled, all found in their homes, and all with their eyes meticulously, surgically removed, a signature that chilled the city to the bone. The killer left no evidence, no prints, just the horrifying absence of the victim's sight. The silence of the precinct, usually a welcome relief, was oppressive tonight. It was 2:47 a.m., the ancient, dust-covered radio on the communications desk, usually only tuned to the dispatch frequency, suddenly crackled. It wasn't the voice of the dispatcher. It was a distorted, high-pitched screech, like metal scraping metal, followed by a soft, almost inaudible whisper. Thorne frowned, pushing himself away from the desk. The sound was impossible. The radio wasn't active. It was just a spare, an antique. He walked over and flicked the power switch. Nothing happened. The radio was dead. He was about to dismiss it as a phantom noise, fatigue and the drumming rain playing tricks, when it happened again. The screech, closer this time, and then the whisper, clearer. It spoke a name. Margot Evans. The 3rd victim of the Whisper Killer. Thorne felt a jolt of cold realization. Only the lead investigators and the medical examiner knew the full name of the victims before the press release. He grabbed the radio's handset, his heart hammering against his ribs. "This is Detective Thorne." "Who is this?" "You're on an unsecured channel." Static hissed back. Then, a dry, male chuckle, completely devoid of humor. "Detective Thorne, you're looking for me in the wrong place. The killer is always closer than the crime scene, isn't he? Turn your head." Thorne froze, his eyes darting around the empty, cavernous room. "I'm looking right at you, pal." "Where are you?" "No, not at the radio." "Turn your head to the east wall. The one with the missing evidence locker door." Thorne slowly turned, his hand inching towards the Sig Sauer holstered at his hip. The east wall held the old, decommissioned evidence room. For weeks, a temporary plywood board had covered a section where a locker door had been damaged and removed for repair. As he watched, a dark stain, the color of old engine oil, began to bleed through the plywood board. It spread rapidly, forming a rough, jagged outline, and then, with a splintering groan that echoed the screech from the radio, the plywood bulged inward, and a single, pale, naked hand punched straight through the temporary barrier. It was impossibly thin, the fingers unnaturally long, and the skin a disturbingly smooth, corpse-like white. It flexed once, a slow, searching motion, and then began to slowly, deliberately rip the wood apart around the opening. Thorne didn't hesitate. He drew his weapon, the loud clack of the slide racking a deafening alarm in the silence. "Police! Don't move!" The creature, or person, on the other side paused. The scraping stopped. The hand retreated back into the darkness behind the wall, and from the radio on the desk, the dry chuckle returned, louder, closer, and somehow, echoing from both the wall and the speaker at the same time. "Too late, Detective. The evidence is inside. And so am I." A heavy thud came from the other side of the wall, followed by the undeniable sound of a door, an internal door that should have been locked and bolted, creaking open further down the hall. Thorne was alone, facing a killer who knew the victim's secrets and was somehow, impossibly, inside the secure, empty police station, emerging not from the front door, but from the forgotten, silent spaces within the building itself. Where does the killer go when the police are asleep? Thorne thought, leveling his gun toward the dark hallway. They go where the evidence is. Detective Thorne's blood ran cold. The internal door he heard creaking open led not to the main exit, but to the sublevel archive, a vast, poorly lit space beneath the precinct used for storing cold case files and forgotten equipment. It was a place nobody went to unless they had to, a tomb of paperwork and dust. Thorne kept his Sig Sauer steady, his eyes scanning the hallway. The laughter from the radio had stopped, leaving only the sound of the relentless rain and the frantic beat of his own heart that he knew he couldn't wait for backup. The nearest patrol car was 20 minutes out, and the killer had already demonstrated impossible access. He had to secure the archive, moving with the trained caution of a combat veteran. Thorne hugged the wall and advanced toward the hallway leading to the archives. The smell hit him first, a thick, metallic odor, like pennies and spoiled meat. It wasn't the clean smell of a gunshot or fresh blood, but something older, fouler, and deeply unsettling that he reached the stairwell. The door to the sublevel was now ajar, a sliver of inky blackness showing in the gap. Thorne kicked the door open completely, his weapon leading the way. "Police! Show me your hands," he yelled, his voice echoing down the concrete stairwell. The archival sublevel was a maze of tall, steel shelving units, dimly lit by a few flickering fluorescent tubes. Shadows stretched and warped across the endless rows of file boxes. The air was heavy, damp, and the strange, metallic smell was overwhelming here that he took the steps two at a time, his boots crunching on dust and what felt suspiciously like fine, gritty ash. As he reached the bottom, he noticed something on the wall to his left, a line of small, deliberate smears of that dark, oil-like substance he'd seen on the plywood board. They looked less like accidental stains and more like directional markers, leading him deeper into the labyrinth. Thorne moved silently between the shelving units, the only sound now the soft squeak of his leather holster. He was hunting, but he felt undeniably hunted. He reached row 17, marked Unsolved, 1980 to 1995. The markers stopped here. In the center of the aisle, illuminated by the sickly light, sat a single, plain manila file folder. It was open. Thorne approached carefully, his gun still raised. He nudged the file with the toe of his boot. It slid across the dusty concrete, revealing the handwritten name on the tab, case #87-112, the blackout victim. Thorne dimly remembered the case. A young woman found dead in a downtown alley in the late 80s. Ruled an overdose, but unofficially suspected of foul play. It was a file so old and cold, only a handful of people in the precinct even knew it existed. He bent down, gripping the file's edge with two fingers, and pulled it toward him. The file wasn't just old paperwork. Lying on top of the original police report was a single, freshly printed photograph. It was a close-up of a human eye, bloodshot and terrified, and pressed right into the center of the pupil was a tiny, dried-up shard of something white and brittle, and pinned to the photograph was a note, scrawled in a frantic, almost unreadable hand. "I watched her through the dark. I watched them all. The eyes are just the window, detective. The evidence is what you fail to see." Before Thorne could fully process the message, a sudden, blindingly bright flash erupted from the other end of the aisle, accompanied by a deafening click. The killer had just taken his picture. Thorne dropped the file and instinctively spun, firing two shots into the blinding light source. The bullets tore through the air, hitting something soft but dense, followed by a muffled thud. The light was gone. The smell was still there, now overlaid with the sharp, acrid scent of gunpowder. He cautiously approached where the flash had been. He found no body, no weapon, only a shattered, disposable camera and, lying beside it, a small, black piece of polished obsidian. The killer hadn't been standing there. He had set a trap. Thorne looked back at the file, at the photograph of the terrified eye. He realized the click of the camera flash wasn't just to blind him, it was a psychological attack, a way to tell him that he, Elias Thorne, was now officially part of the killer's portfolio. He turned and bolted toward the stairs. He had to get out of the archives. He had to find out how many secrets this killer knew, and what he just left behind, because one thing was clear, the whispered killer wasn't just after the victims anymore, He was after the police themselves. Detective Thorne burst out of the archives, scrambling up the stairs, the metallic stench of the sublevel clinging to his uniform. He checked the hallway, still deserted. The rain outside continued its hypnotic drumming, isolating the precinct in a world of its own. That he slammed the archive door shut and bolted it with a heavy chain he found hanging nearby. It wouldn't hold the killer, but it might buy him a few seconds. Thorne ran back to the main communications desk and grabbed the secure landline, dialing dispatch. "This is Thorne at Precinct 7. I need immediate backup. Armed suspect inside the building. Repeat, armed officer down. Wait, no, I'm okay, but the suspect is armed and inside." He paused, realizing how insane the request sounded. "Look, just send every available unit. Code 3. He slammed the phone down. He couldn't rely on the radio. The killer seemed to be manipulating the spare unit, or perhaps broadcasting on a frequency only the old receiver picked up. That he sprinted back to the bullpen, his eyes sweeping the desks. He needed to find what the killer was looking for. Why the precinct? Why the archives? He stopped dead at his own desk. The corkboard dedicated to the Whispered Killer case had been rearranged. It wasn't vandalism, it was surgical. The killer had moved the photographs of the three victims, Margot Evans, Sarah Jenkins, and the first, nameless man, to form a perfect triangle, and in the very center of this new formation, where the thumbtacks met, a single, folded piece of paper was pinned. Thorne carefully plucked it from the board. It wasn't a note. It was a fragment torn from an old, brittle blueprint, labeled Precinct 7 Structural Layout, 1957. The fragment detailed the walls surrounding the old, decommissioned evidence locker, the very wall the hand had punched through. A specific section was circled in dark ink, a narrow, unmarked space labeled Ventilation Shaft Access/Storage. A hidden space. The killer wasn't just inside the precinct, he was using the very structure of the building as his hiding place. He knew the building better than the people who worked here. Thorne's mind raced. Someone with deep knowledge of the building's architecture, someone who could move through the walls. He remembered the oil-like substance and the impossibly thin hand. He moved quickly, following the blueprint fragment to the east wall, where the plywood barricade now showed a gaping, jagged hole. He shone his tactical light into the void. The space was dark, dusty, and smelled strongly of insulation and the metallic odor from the archives. It wasn't just a small gap, it was the entry point to a narrow, claustrophobic crawlspace that ran behind the heavy concrete wall. He was about to squeeze through when he saw something catching the light on the floor inside the crawlspace, a small, silver item. He reached in and pulled it out. It was a name tag from an old uniform, tarnished with age and dust. He wiped the grime off with his thumb and read the engraved name, Officer T. Hastings. Thorne didn't recognize the name. This precinct had been built over half a century ago. T. Hastings was likely long gone, retired, or deceased. He flipped the name tag over. Engraved poorly on the back, as if etched with a crude, sharp tool, were 3 sets of coordinates. Thorne quickly punched the numbers into his phone's GPS app. They weren't map coordinates. They were latitude and longitude pointing to 3 locations: Margot Evans's house, Sarah Jenkins's house, the alley where the blackout victim from the archives was found. The killer wasn't just connecting his victims, he was connecting himself to the building, and the building to a forgotten officer named T. Hastings. Just then, the dispatch radio on the desk burst to life. Precinct 7, this is dispatch. We have patrol units en route, ETA 5 minutes. Detective Thorne, acknowledge. I acknowledge, dispatch, Thorne replied, his voice tight. As soon as he finished speaking, the screech came back from the old, dead radio beside him. The high-pitched, metallic shriek, and then, a whisper, chillingly close to the microphone. T. Hastings was the perfect witness, detective. But you only believe what you see. Thorne looked down at the name tag in his hand. T. Hastings was a witness, to what? A witness to the blackout victim, He looked back at the narrow, dark hole in the wall, realizing the terrible truth. The killer had not just entered the precinct. He had been living inside the walls. And he had likely used T. Hastings's discarded knowledge to build his terrifying method. Thorne clipped the name tag to his belt, shoved the blueprint fragment into his pocket, and, ignoring the arrival of the patrol cars, squeezed through the hole, entering the dark, structural heart of the police station to face the phantom hidden within. The crawlspace was a suffocating labyrinth of dusty pipes, electrical conduits, and brittle, asbestos-laced insulation. Detective Thorne moved on his belly and elbows, the beam of his tactical light cutting through the oppressive darkness. The metallic, foul odor was now so strong it tasted like rust in the back of his throat that he was inside the walls, in the hidden spaces, what the killer had called the veins of the precinct. Thorne realized the genius and horror of the killer's method. He wasn't breaking in, he was simply moving within a space that had been sealed off and forgotten for decades. He could listen to every conversation, monitor every case file, and strike with total impunity that he followed the narrow shaft as it descended, guided by occasional smears of the dark, oil-like substance. His uniform snagged on a broken pipe, and a shower of fine, gray dust rained down, making him cough. As he reached a small, vertical access chamber, the light beam illuminated something stapled to a thick support beam, a faded, yellowed, missing person poster from the late 1980s. The face on the poster was the same as the blackout victim in the archives file. Before she was identified, she was the connection. Officer T. Hastings was the perfect witness to her disappearance, and the killer had memorialized the moment in the hidden crawlspace. Thorne reached the bottom of the chamber. He was now directly underneath the bullpen floor. He could hear the faint, muffled sound of sirens outside, growing closer. Backup was arriving. A sudden, sharp scratching sound echoed from the darkness just ahead, near the floor. It was a rhythmic, chitinous scraping, like a large insect dragging itself over concrete. Thorne flattened himself against the cold metal casing of a water main, holding his breath, his Sig Sauer steady. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural hiss. "You shouldn't be here, Detective," the whisper came, not from the radio this time, but from the darkness itself. It sounded dry, parched, and closer than breathing. "This space belongs to the blind." Thorne didn't respond. He knew the killer was playing games, trying to locate his exact position. He quickly swept his light. The beam landed on a small alcove where the concrete foundation met a large, corroded furnace duct, and there, huddled and shivering, was a figure. It was impossibly pale, its limbs thin and contorted to fit the narrow space. It wasn't Officer T. Hastings. It was a young man, no older than his early 20s, dressed in threadbare civilian clothes, his eyes wide with absolute, animal terror. He wasn't the killer. He was a victim. Thorne lowered his weapon slightly. "Easy. I'm Detective Thorne. I'm police. Are you hurt?" The young man tried to speak, but only a desperate rasp escaped his lips. He pointed a trembling, skeletal finger past Thorne, toward the direction they had both come from, back up the shaft. Thorne didn't need to ask. He knew the killer was using the victim as bait, a distraction, but as Thorne began to turn back toward the danger, the young man grabbed his ankle with surprising strength. He pulled Thorne closer, his breath fetid and horrible. "He told me," he said. "T. Hastings never left," the young man whispered, his eyes frantically darting up towards the ceiling. "He's watching, from the ducts." At that precise moment, a sound erupted directly above them, a heavy, booming clang as a ceiling tile in the bullpen was violently displaced. The killer was no longer in the walls, he was in the ceiling, about to drop directly into the arriving backup. Thorne had a split-second choice: save the terrified victim or stop the killer from causing a massacre upstairs. He looked at the boy, then back at the dark ceiling. "Stay here," he ordered, pulling his ankle free. Thorne sprinted back toward the main shaft, ignoring the panic rising in his chest. He heard the young man's terrified whimper fade behind him. He climbed back up into the structural breach, emerging from the wall just as the front doors of Precinct 7 flew open and 3 uniformed officers rushed into the bullpen, flashlights blazing. "Thorne! What the hell is going on?" yelled Sergeant Morales, weapon drawn. "He's in the ceiling. Above the front desk," Thorne shouted, pointing upward. As they all looked up, a dark shape detached itself from the shadows above the main counter. It wasn't the oil-stained figure Thorne expected. It was an old, brittle police uniform, stretched tight and stuffed with something lumpy and misshapen. It landed with a dry, papery thump on the front desk, and sticking out from the collar of the uniform, instead of a head, was a single, long, pale human spine, stripped clean of all flesh, culminating in a single, fixed, terrifyingly white eye socket, staring directly at Detective Thorne, the uniform of Officer T. Hastings. Chaos erupted in the bullpen. The three uniformed officers recoiled at the sight of the macabre mannequin, the empty, stuffed uniform of Officer T. Hastings, crowned with a horrifyingly exposed spinal column and a vacant eye socket. Sergeant Morales, a veteran with a steely resolve, quickly regained composure. "Secure the perimeter. 2 units sweep the ceiling and ventilation. Thorne, report." "What is that thing?" Thorne, breathing heavily, kept his eyes on the object, not his surroundings. He felt the killer was mocking them, distracting them with theatrical horror. "It's a decoy, Sergeant. A message. The killer has been using the old crawlspaces and ducts. He knows the building and he knew Officer T. Hastings." Thorne strode to the desk and cautiously examined the uniform. It was authentic, an old-style wool uniform from the late 80s. Pinned to the chest pocket was a new, freshly printed note. T. Hastings saw the first one. "I gave him the gift of silence. The blind are the only ones who truly see, Detective. You need to lose your sight to find the key." As Thorne read the note, one of the patrol officers, Officer Riley, screamed from the far side of the bullpen. "Morales! Look at this!" Everyone turned. Officer Riley was pointing at the row of lockers near the back wall. The lockers belonged to the night shift, currently unoccupied. On every single locker door, about 20 in total, the killer had meticulously painted a symbol in the same dark, oil-like substance. It was a crude, jagged drawing of an open eye with a horizontal line slashed through it. "He must have been doing this while I was in the archives," Thorne muttered, realizing how extensive the killer's internal access was. The killer had been in the bullpen the whole time, working right over their heads. Morales grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, we have a possible 10 to 18, suspect escape. He's out, or he's still in the walls. Lock down the entire building. Nobody enters, nobody leaves." Thorne ignored the rising panic and focused on the note. "The blind are the only ones who truly see. You need to lose your sight to find the key." The signature act of the Whisper Killer was removing the victim's eyes. It was a deliberate, thematic act, not just an aesthetic one. Suddenly, the fragmented blueprint of Precinct 7, still clutched in his hand, seemed to shift in meaning. "Sergeant, the missing evidence locker door. Where did they take it?" Thorne asked urgently. Morales frowned. "The repair shop, a couple of months ago." "Why?" "No, the door. The physical piece of metal. It hasn't been replaced. They must have stored it somewhere in the building while waiting for the new one." Thorne realized the killer wasn't talking about losing his physical sight, he was talking about losing the sight of the police, their focus on the crime scene and the victims, to look instead at the blind spots within the precinct itself. He ran over to the bullpen's central column, where the building maintenance records were kept. He flipped through the logs until he found the entry for the locker door repair. The door, heavy and thick, was logged as being temporarily stored in the unused storage annex, basement level. "Basement," Thorne said, his voice quiet but sharp. "There's a second basement level. Not the archive. A maintenance level. Nobody ever goes there." "Thorne, we're sweeping the ceilings, we can't," Morales started. "This is it, Sergeant," Thorne interrupted, pointing at the blueprint fragment. "The structural plan for the annex has an emergency egress tunnel. If the killer is using the building as his lair, he's using that annex to get in and out." Thorne rushed to the stairwell that led to the basement maintenance level. It was located behind the boiler room, tucked away and padlocked. "I need bolt cutters," Thorne yelled back at the officers. Before anyone could move, a blood-curdling, echoing scream tore through the silence of the precinct, coming from the main stairwell leading down to the archives, the one Thorne had just bolted. The victim, Thorne realized, his heart sinking. The young man he left in the crawlspace, the killer had come back for him. He looked at the padlocked door to the annex. One path led to the killer's escape route, the key to the entire case. The other led to a desperate, last-minute rescue. Thorne glanced at the spine-crowned uniform of T. Hastings, at the symbols of blindness, and made his decision. The killer wanted him to rush to the scream, to lose his focus. He turned and slammed his shoulder against the maintenance door, testing the lock. It held firm. "Get the cutters," he roared, drawing his weapon. "And two of you, go check the archive stairwell, but do not go down." Thorne knew the killer was giving him the ultimate gift of sight, the knowledge that every action he took was being manipulated. He was closing in on the physical evidence, but the killer was already ahead, leaving a trail of panic and psychological wreckage. The bolt cutters arrived, and the thick, iron padlock on the basement annex door snapped with a clean, sharp crack. Sergeant Morales and a patrol officer stood behind Thorne, covering his back, their faces grim. The scream from the archive stairwell had ceased, leaving only a haunting, absolute silence. Thorne kicked the door open and stepped into the pitch black. The air here was colder, denser, and reeked of mildew and decay, overlaying the metallic stench of the killer. "Stay here and secure this entrance," Thorne commanded, shining his light into the oppressive dark. "If you hear anything, lock the door and call the SWAT team. I'm going in alone." The basement annex was unlike the neat, organized archives. It was a chaotic cavern filled with broken desks, obsolete servers, defunct evidence bags, and construction refuse. Thorne moved slowly, his light beam dancing across decades of police refuse. He found it near the back wall. The missing locker door. It was propped upright against a stack of cinder blocks, its dark gray metal surface covered in that sickening, oil-like substance. But it wasn't just stained, it was scratched and etched with thousands of tiny, frantic symbols, the same anti-eye symbol he'd seen on the bullpen lockers. It wasn't a door, it was a canvas, a manifesto of madness. Thorne pulled on a pair of gloves and ran his hand over the metal, feeling the deep cuts. The symbols coalesced into a dense pattern, radiating outward from a central point. He shined his light on the area immediately behind the door. The wall was constructed of rough, uneven brick. And set into the wall, almost perfectly camouflaged, was a narrow, steel utility hatch, secured with a modern, heavy-duty padlock. This is his escape route, Thorne realized. His operational base. He quickly scanned the floor around the hatch for a key, but found nothing. He pulled out the fragment of Officer T. Hastings's blueprint and compared it to the wall. The hatch was perfectly aligned with the spot marked emergency egress tunnel. Then, he noticed something in the dust near the hatch, 2 deep, drag marks, ending at a pile of discarded industrial canvas sheets. Thorne pulled the canvas away. Lying underneath was the young man from the crawlspace. But he wasn't just dead. He was staged. The young man was laid out on a clean sheet of plastic, his face pale and slack. And, in the killer's sickening signature, his eyes had been surgically removed. Pinned to the boy's chest was another note, written in the same crude, frantic hand. "I told you, detective. The evidence is what you failed to see. Look at the witness. Look at what he saw." Thorne felt a wave of cold fury and nausea. The young man had seen the killer in the crawlspace, and the killer had punished him by taking the only thing that mattered to Thorne, a positive identification. Thorne lowered his head for a second, fighting the urge to vomit. He looked back at the steel hatch. He had to get inside that he noticed that the lock on the hatch wasn't secured by a number combination, but by a series of 5 small, circular holes for a unique key. Thorne remembered the terrifying moment earlier, the spine-crowned uniform of Officer T. Hastings. He had to assume that the key to this lair was somehow connected to the dead officer. That he pulled the T. Hastings name tag from his pocket and looked at the crude coordinates etched on the back, the 3 murder sites. Suddenly, the symbol of the slashed eye and the theme of blindness clicked into place. The killer's method wasn't about simply removing sight, it was about replacing it with his own dark knowledge. Thorne's eyes landed on the lock again. 5 holes. 5 victims, if he counted the young man and T. Hastings. Thorne dug through the canvas sheets the killer had used. He found an old, tattered piece of police equipment, a heavy-duty utility belt from the 80s. Attached to the belt, in a small leather pouch, were 5 small, oddly shaped tools, a set of lock picks and specialized keys. Thorne picked the most unique key, a strange, 5-pronged piece of metal. He hesitantly inserted it into the lock's 5 holes. With a definitive, metallic clunk, the lock turned. Thorne took a deep breath, raised his Sig Sauer, and pulled the hatch open. Inside was not a tunnel, but a small, meticulously maintained room, the true lair of the Whisper Killer. The walls were covered in old police reports, blueprints, and photographs, all cross-referenced with red string, connecting every cold case to the present murders. In the center of the room, illuminated by a bare hanging bulb, was a workbench. On the workbench sat a stack of polished, black obsidian shards, the same material left at the scene in the archives. And then, Thorne saw the final, sickening truth. On the wall, surrounded by a dozen photographs of the blackout victim, was a framed, official Police Academy graduation photograph from 1957. The central figure in the photo was a young, sharp-featured officer, T. Hastings, but next to him, cropped and almost unrecognizable due to age, was a second, smaller figure, smiling faintly, and scrawled beneath the second figure's face, in the killer's oily substance, was the single, chilling word, apprentice. T. Hastings hadn't just been a witness, he had a partner. And the killer who was now loose wasn't T. Hastings. He was the Dark Legacy, the apprentice who had taken his master's obsession and perfected it. Detective Thorne stepped fully into the small, hidden room, the lair of the Whisper Killer. The sheer organization was terrifying. It wasn't the den of a random lunatic, it was the meticulous study of a man consumed by the dark history of the precinct. The walls were plastered with a chilling timeline. The Whisper Killer's victims, Evans, Jenkins, and the third, nameless man, were linked by red thread, not to each other, but backward in time to the 1980s, blackout victim, case #87-112. And the blackout victim was linked directly to Officer T. Hastings. Thorne focused on the workbench. He picked up one of the shards of polished obsidian. It was incredibly sharp. He realized the killer hadn't just used surgical tools, he had used these to gouge out the eyes, then smoothed the wound with a meticulous, artistic reverence. The obsidian was the final, signature touch. On the workbench was a large, worn leather-bound journal. Thorne flipped it open. It was written in a formal, neat hand, the handwriting of Officer T. Hastings. The journal was a detailed log, starting in 1987. Hastings wasn't a killer, he was a paranoid, obsessive documentarian. He had secretly been tracking the blackout victim case, convinced the precinct had wrongly ruled it an overdose to cover up an institutional failure. Journal entry, 10/12/1987, they closed it. A lie. I saw the marks on her neck. I saw the fear in her eyes before they washed her out of the alley with the morning rain. They are blind. They don't see the evidence in their own reports. They don't see the dark spots. Hastings had used the building's crawlspaces, mapped out in the discovered blueprint, to spy on his own colleagues, believing the precinct itself was corrupt and blind to the truth. But then, the entries changed. Journal entry, 03/05/1988, the apprentice sees. He is not blind. He understands the architecture of the truth. He knows the building's secrets and its dark spots. He says the eyes must be taken, not to silence the victim, but to silence the witness in the mind of the blind. Thorne realized the horrifying truth. T. Hastings had found his apprentice and, in his obsession, had unwittingly taught him how to use the precinct as a base of operations, sharing the secrets of the hidden crawlspaces and the egress tunnel. He flipped to the last journal entry, dated 1989. Journal entry 08/19/1989. He took the eyes. Not hers. Mine. I saw him take the eyes of the truth. He used the obsidian. Beautiful and clean. He said I was finally complete. I am silent now. I am the perfect witness, detective. And now, I only see the dark. T. Hastings hadn't simply retired or died. The apprentice had murdered him inside the precinct walls, using his own obsession as a weapon, and then sealed him away, claiming his identity as the ultimate, unseen observer. The stuffed uniform found in the bullpen was likely the body of Officer T. Hastings himself. Thorne's eyes swept the room again, looking for any ID on the apprentice. He found an old police ID card, ripped in half and tacked to the wall, dating back to 1985. The picture was faded, but the man was younger, with cold, unsettling eyes. The name on the ID, Archer Mackenzie. A former records clerk who was dismissed for gross negligence shortly after the blackout victim case was closed. A records clerk. He had access to every name, every report, every cold case. He wasn't a cop, he was a ghost, born of the precinct's forgotten failures. Just then, Thorne's attention was drawn to a heavy, stone slab covering a section of the floor near the egress hatch. The slab was marked with the same anti-eye symbol. Thorne shouldered his Sig Sauer and used the steel butt to strike the stone. It didn't budge. He found an iron pry bar near the workbench and, with a heave, wrenched the slab aside. The floor opened into a dark, narrow shaft, a deeper sublevel, but before Thorne could look down, the phone on the workbench, an old, rotary phone that wasn't connected to any line, began to ring. Thorne froze. It rang twice, a high, tinny, unnatural sound that he slowly picked up. The receiver, the voice was the dry, parched whisper from the radio, now right in his ear. You found the master, detective. You found his dark spots. But you didn't see the key, did you? The eyes of the apprentice are now looking at your family. The egress tunnel is a nice, quick way out of the city. You have 5 minutes. A new sound, the heavy, echoing clank of the steel egress hatch slamming shut and locking from the outside, reverberated through the small room. Archer Mackenzie, the apprentice, had anticipated Thorne's every move. He had locked the detective in the bunker and was now heading out of the city, using the very escape route Thorne had just discovered. And he was targeting Thorne's last connection to the world outside the precinct's walls. Detective Thorne slammed the rotary phone down, the dial tone a mocking buzz in the confined space. He lunged at the heavy steel egress hatch, pulling and kicking, but the lock held firm. Archer Mackenzie, the apprentice, was long gone. Using the secret tunnel he and Hastings had mapped out decades ago, Thorne was trapped in the sealed, underground lair of a meticulous serial killer, while the killer was now hunting his family. He checked his service weapon. Half a magazine left. He had to stay focused. 5 minutes, the killer said. 5 minutes to get out and start the pursuit. Thorne looked around the room, desperate for another way out. He quickly searched the journal and the blueprints on the workbench. The plans confirmed the egress tunnel was the only entry/exit point aside from the hatch, which was now sealed. His eyes fell on the hole in the floor, the uncovered shaft leading to the deeper sublevel. It was his only option. He radioed Sergeant Morales, his voice strained. Morales. I'm trapped in a sublevel annex, behind the maintenance room. The killer, Archer Mackenzie, has locked the egress hatch and is targeting my family. He has a 5-minute head start. Find the key to the hatch, now. It's a specialized 5-pronged key. Get down here. Thorne, we hear you. We're checking the locker room. Stay calm. Morales's voice crackled back, sounding distant and frantic. Thorne dropped the pry bar and grabbed the nearest rope, a dusty length of climbing cord found in a duffel bag, and quickly secured it to the heavy workbench. He clipped his flashlight to his belt and lowered himself into the dark shaft. The air in the shaft was immediately colder and wetter. The descent was difficult. The shaft was narrow and lined with jagged concrete. After sliding down about 20 feet, his boots landed on a slippery, uneven floor that he was in an old municipal storm drain tunnel, a forgotten vein connecting the precinct to the city's obsolete infrastructure that he pulled out his light. The tunnel was wide enough to walk hunched over, filled with stagnant water and debris. The metallic odor of the killer was strongest here, mixed with the stench of sewage and damp earth that he saw fresh footprints in the thick mud, long, narrow, boot prints heading rapidly away from the precinct. Archer Mackenzie had fled through the sewer system. Thorne started running, sloshing through the water, the darkness absolute. He kept his gun out, though he knew he was unlikely to catch the killer here. His objective was simply to get out. The tunnel was a horrifying sprint. He ran for what felt like 2 minutes, the time ticking away in his head. The tunnel curved and branched, offering multiple paths. Mackenzie knew this map. Thorne didn't. That he stopped at a junction. 3 tunnels. Which way? He knelt down and shone his light on the wet concrete. He found one tiny piece of evidence, a small scratch mark on the wall of the left tunnel, the same signature/mark over an invisible eye. The killer is telling me where to go, Thorne thought, because he wants me to chase him. He ignored the marked tunnel and took the one on the right, guessing the killer would direct him towards a planned ambush or a dead end. After another minute of frantic running, the tunnel started to narrow, and he saw a faint light ahead, a break in the darkness. He scrambled up a crumbling concrete wall toward the light. He emerged into a small, overgrown utility access point, hidden by thick, thorny bushes. He pushed his way out, tearing his uniform. He was in an alleyway, blocks away from Precinct 7. He checked his watch. 4 minutes and 30 seconds had passed since the call. He pulled out his phone and frantically dialed his wife, Sarah. No answer. He left a hurried message. Sarah, listen to me, you need to leave the house immediately. Do not call the police, just get out and go to the diner on 3rd Street. I'll explain later. Please, Sarah. He tried to call Morales to update his location, but the connection was weak. Thorne took off running down the alley toward the street, his heart sinking. With every step. He knew Mackenzie was fast, meticulous, and obsessed with the idea of silencing witnesses. He reached the street corner and stopped, scanning the quiet residential area, and then, he saw it, parked 2 blocks down, directly across the street from his own house, was a dusty, black sedan. It was completely nondescript, but Thorne noticed the glint of polished obsidian decorating the front dashboard. Archer Mackenzie was there. He hadn't fled the city. He had simply used the tunnels to get to Thorne's home faster than any patrol car could. Thorne started running, but he knew he was too far. As he ran, the front door of his house slowly opened, and a tall, thin figure stepped out onto the porch. The figure turned, and in the faint glow of the street lamp, Thorne saw that the figure was wearing a dusty, old-style police uniform, a perfect replica of the T. Hastings uniform. The killer raised a hand, and in the palm, he held a dark, shiny object that glinted in the light. It wasn't a knife. It was Sarah's wedding ring, the ultimate silence. The witness to Thorne's life had been acquired. Detective Thorne didn't break stride, sprinting toward his house with a desperate, primal fear overriding his training. His mind screamed at the sight of the figure in the T. Hastings uniform holding his wife Sarah's wedding ring. He reached the edge of his property, diving behind his neighbor's parked truck, weapon raised and trained on the killer. Mackenzie! Thorne yelled, his voice raw with fury. Let her go. You want me? I'm here. Let her go. The figure, Archer Mackenzie, stood motionless on Thorne's porch, bathed in the sickly yellow street lamp light. He raised his free hand in a slow, almost theatrical wave. He was tall and gaunt, his face a hollow mask of cold satisfaction. "Detective Thorne," Mackenzie whispered, his voice carrying clearly on the silent street. "The chaos of the precinct is over. We are now in the field, where the truth is much clearer. I didn't take your wife, Detective. I merely acquired the witness to your life. The witness to your blindness." Thorne swallowed hard, his finger tight on the trigger. "Where is she?" Mackenzie chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. He then reached up and adjusted the collar of the borrowed, vintage uniform. "Did you look inside the home, Detective? Or did you just assume the monster was waiting on the porch?" Thorne hesitated. He knew this was a psychological trap. If he rushed the porch, Mackenzie would use him as a shield or disappear. "If you've hurt her, I swear I will put you in the ground right here," Thorne hissed. Mackenzie's eyes were cold and focused. "I hurt nothing that wasn't already hurt. Look around you, Detective. Look at your blind spot." Mackenzie suddenly lowered his hand and slowly, deliberately, tossed the wedding ring onto the lawn. It hit the grass with a tiny, tragic clink, then, in a movement that defied his frail appearance, Mackenzie turned, vaulted the porch railing, and disappeared into the dense shadows between Thorne's house and the neighbor's fence. He was gone, dissolving into the residential night. Thorne didn't follow. He rushed the front door, his heart hammering the truth. Mackenzie wouldn't have waited on the porch if Sarah was still inside that he burst into the house. The lights were on. The living room was empty, untouched. The kitchen was cleared that he ran to the bedroom. Empty, then, he saw it. The hallway leading to the back door was slightly ajar. And sitting on the small table by the door was Sarah's cell phone, placed carefully on top of a note written in Sarah's familiar hand. Thorne grabbed the note, his hands shaking. "Elias, I got your message. I'm fine. I knew it was serious. I left immediately and went to the diner on 3rd Street. I'm waiting there. I love you." A wave of crushing relief washed over Thorne, making his knees weak. Sarah was safe. She had followed his hurried, frantic instructions and was out of the house before Mackenzie could get to her. But wait. If Sarah was already gone, how did Mackenzie acquire the witness? Thorne's eyes focused on the killer's calling card, the eyes. The obsidian. The signature of the Whisper Killer. That he quickly scanned the back of the house. Nothing seemed out of place. That he finally walked into the small sunroom at the back, where Sarah kept her collection of exotic orchids. The orchids were fine. But on the central shelving unit, something else was missing. Thorne stopped. Sarah had kept 2 things on that shelf, a small, framed photo of their wedding day, and a small, antique jewelry box. The box that held the wedding ring and other family heirlooms. The jewelry box was still there, but it was open. The wedding ring was gone, retrieved from the box and tossed onto the lawn by Mackenzie, and lying next to the open box was another, smaller piece of paper, written in Mackenzie's tight, careful script. "She didn't see me, Detective. But this did. Every memory she cherished. Every lie you lived. I acquired the witness to your life, Elias Thorne. The past is the true blind spot." Thorne understood. Mackenzie hadn't taken Sarah. He had taken the memories and emotional artifacts of their life, the wedding ring, the symbolic witness to their bond, to use against Thorne. He was proving that he could pierce the detective's most intimate security just as easily as he pierced the precinct's walls. The killer was gone, but the threat was now intensely personal. Thorne had lost the chase. He now had to find Mackenzie before the apprentice could weaponize the private, painful histories he had acquired. Thorne pulled out his phone, now getting a faint signal. He had to alert Morales and the patrol units. But he couldn't leave Sarah exposed. That he made a hard choice. He was going to the diner on 3rd Street. And he was going there fast. Detective Thorne drove his beat-up sedan, lights off, tearing through the residential streets. The drive to the diner on 3rd Street felt like an eternity, every shadow a potential ambush. He had managed to send a quick text to Morales. Mackenzie escaped, hit my house, Sarah safe at 3rd Street Diner. Killer is on foot, watch the sewer exits that he screeched to a halt outside the brightly lit, 24-hour establishment. The diner was quiet, its windows misted with condensation. Thorne rushed inside, his eyes immediately scanning the booths. He spotted Sarah immediately, sitting alone at a booth near the back, nursing a cup of coffee. She looked pale but unharmed. Sarah. She looked up, her expression shifting from fear to profound relief. She ran to him, hugging him tightly. Elias, what is going on? I saw your message, I was so scared. I heard a car screech away right after I pulled out. Thorne held her close, letting the physical reality of her safety anchor him. He was here, Sarah. The Whisper Killer. He used the tunnels and came straight for us. But you followed my instructions. You're safe. We need to go. As he pulled her away from the booth, his eyes landed on the table. Sarah hadn't been alone. Across from her, resting against the sugar dispenser, was a small, antique locket, an heirloom Sarah rarely wore. Thorne's breath hitched. Where did you get that, Sarah? Sarah looked confused. That's my grandmother's locket. It was in the jewelry box. I must have grabbed it when I left in a panic. Thorne remembered the open jewelry box and the missing wedding ring. Sarah hadn't grabbed the locket in a panic. Mackenzie had placed it there. Thorne gently picked up the locket. It was heavy, gold, and intricately engraved. He flipped it open. Inside were 2 tiny, faded photographs, one of Sarah's grandmother, and one of a young police officer in a uniform from the 1950s. It wasn't Officer T. Hastings. It was a man Thorne didn't recognize, but his uniform style and the photograph's age matched the era of the precinct's construction. He handed the locket to Sarah, his voice flat. Who is this man, Sarah? Sarah took the locket, frowning. That's my grandfather, Elias. Chief George Riley. He was the chief of police back in the late 50s. My grandmother always kept that photo of him from his early days. The name struck Thorne like a physical blow. Chief George Riley. The man who would have been in charge when the precinct was constructed in 1957. The man who would have overseen the very architecture that included the secret tunnels. Thorne looked back at the apprentice's lair, at the walls covered in old blueprints, the obsession with the precinct's hidden structure. Your grandfather, Thorne muttered, realization dawning. He was the architect. He built the blind spots. He created the system that T. Hastings exposed. Mackenzie, the former records clerk, obsessed with the precinct's failures, wasn't just using the tunnels, he was targeting the legacy of the man who created them, Sarah's grandfather. Thorne realized the personal significance of the attack. Sarah was not just the witness to Thorne's life, she was the familial witness to the precinct's dark past. He quickly opened the police ID of Archer Mackenzie again, the former records clerk. The face was cold, emotionless. Thorne looked at Sarah's grandfather's photo again. Chief Riley. Sarah, Thorne said urgently. Did your grandfather ever talk about the old precinct? About any strange deaths or cover-ups? Sarah shook her head, tears welling up. No, he died when I was young. He was always very proud of building that station, but he called it his white elephant. He said it was the biggest mistake of his career, but he never said why. A white elephant, Thorne repeated. A costly, useless possession. Mackenzie had placed the locket, a relic of Chief Riley, on the table to show Thorne that the connection wasn't random, it was genealogical. The killer wasn't just after Thorne's failure, he was after the chief's failure. Thorne looked down at the locket in Sarah's hand. He realized the locket wasn't meant to be a simple taunt. It was the key to the next location. "We need to go, Sarah," Thorne said, pulling her toward the exit. "We're going somewhere safe, right now." Just as they reached the door, the diner's small, old-fashioned payphone on the wall began to ring. It was loud, shrill, and entirely out of place in the quiet diner. Thorne froze. He knew who it was. The killer had followed them. He reached for the phone, then pulled his hand back. He wouldn't play the killer's game, but Sarah, her nerves frayed, reached the phone first, her hand trembling. "Don't, Sarah!" Thorne yelled, but it was too late. Sarah lifted the receiver to her ear, her eyes went wide with sudden, absolute terror. She dropped the phone, the receiver swung loose on its cord. Thorne heard the dry, rasping whisper from the line, "She has the relic, Detective. Now tell her to open the other eye. The one you refused to see. The one you failed to protect." Thorne grabbed the phone and slammed it against the wall, smashing the receiver. He grabbed Sarah and pulled her out the door. "He knows about the locket, Sarah. He knows everything. We have to go, now." But as they ran into the parking lot, Sarah wasn't looking at him. She was looking back at the diner's window, and she was pointing at the small, antique gold locket still clutched in her hand. "Elias," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't remember putting that locket on the table. I just thought I had it." Thorne looked back at the phone, then at the locket. Archer Mackenzie hadn't just placed the locket there. He had somehow planted the memory of taking it, blurring the line between physical evidence and psychological torment. The apprentice had truly mastered the art of the perfect witness. Detective Thorne pulled Sarah into the car, his mind racing to connect Chief Riley, the locket, the precinct's white elephant, and the blackout victim. He had to assume the next target was tied directly to Chief Riley's legacy. "Sarah, where did your grandfather keep his old papers? Anything related to the precinct's construction or his police career?" Thorne asked, his voice urgent but controlled. Sarah, still shaken by the phone call, struggled to focus. "The attic, I think. At the old family house." But it was just junk, old uniforms, files. Thorne drove away from the diner, heading toward the abandoned family home. He knew he couldn't take Sarah to the precinct, and the old house, with its potential secrets, was the only place Mackenzie could logically strike next. As they drove, Thorne took the gold locket from Sarah. He examined it under the dim streetlights. The engraving was ornate, too deep and busy to be a simple floral pattern. He realized the pattern wasn't floral. It was a stylized, continuous circuit board pattern. A map. Thorne remembered the blueprint fragment, the obsession with the architecture. Chief Riley, the architect, hadn't just built a police station, he had built a trap. Thorne traced the engraving with his thumb. The circuit pattern contained an abbreviation etched so small it was almost invisible. W.T. W.E.T., Thorne whispered. White Elephant Tunnel. The emergency egress tunnel Mackenzie used to escape. The locket was the key. He pressed down on a specific node in the circuit pattern, guided by the T. Hastings coordinates on his belt. With a soft click, the back of the locket popped open, revealing not a third photo, but a tiny, folded piece of vellum paper. Thorne carefully unfolded the brittle paper. It contained a hand-drawn sketch, labeled in Chief Riley's careful script, the WET terminus. It was a sketch of a building exterior, an old, abandoned municipal incinerator plant near the city's industrial waterfront. The drawing marked a hidden, sealed-off chimney stack labeled ventilation/final egress. The incinerator plant, Thorne said, slamming his hand on the steering wheel. The tunnel doesn't end in the sewer. It ends there. That's where Mackenzie has been hiding and where he keeps the real evidence. Thorne called Morales and gave the coordinates, telling him to surround the abandoned plant immediately. And, Sergeant, Thorne added grimly, bring a full forensic team. We're going to find a lot of bodies. He dropped Sarah off at a safe, undisclosed location, the home of an old, trusted colleague, and drove straight to the waterfront. The abandoned incinerator plant was a massive, desolate structure of rusted steel and cracked concrete, dominated by two colossal, smokeless chimney stacks. The entire area was silent, bathed in the eerie yellow glow of industrial floodlights. Thorne saw the patrol cars already setting up a perimeter. Morales was waiting for him, his face pale in the light. "We have the perimeter secured, Detective. But no sign of entry." "The main doors are welded shut," Morales reported. Thorne pulled out the vellum sketch. "The entry isn't the main door, Sergeant. It's the northernmost chimney stack. He used it as the ventilation for the egress tunnel." They approached the massive, black concrete base of the northern chimney. They found a small, rusted maintenance grate, almost completely buried by overgrown ivy and debris. Thorne pulled off the grate. Inside, a narrow, vertical service ladder descended into pitch darkness. The metallic, oily stench of the killer immediately wafted out. "He's down there," Thorne stated, pulling his light and gun. "I'm going with you," Morales insisted. "No, Sergeant. You're the witness. You secure the exit. If I don't come back, this place is the answer to the Whisper Killer. Do not come down." Thorne started the descent. The ladder was wet and slick. After dropping about 30 feet, he reached a solid floor. He was in a large, circular chamber beneath the chimney. The air was dead and thick with dust as he shone his light around. The chamber. In the center of the floor was a gaping hole, the mouth of the emergency egress tunnel, and standing right next to the tunnel entrance, waiting for him, was Archer Mackenzie. That he had removed the T. Hastings uniform. He was wearing clean, drab maintenance clothes, and his face was calm, almost serene. In his hands, he held a heavy, ceremonial Police Academy sword, one of the old, gilded parade swords from the precinct's trophy case, and hanging from the tip of the blade, shining under the lone ceiling bulb, were the 3 pairs of eyes, the terrible, final trophies of the Whisper Killer. "I knew you wouldn't miss the final blind spot, Detective," Mackenzie said, his voice flat. "The one thing Chief Riley couldn't burn. Your family's past, and your future. Come to the light, Elias Thorne. Come and be the perfect witness." Detective Thorne held his position, his Sig Sauer steady. Archer Mackenzie stood between Thorne and the egress tunnel, illuminated by the single, dusty ceiling bulb. The sight of the 3 pairs of human eyes dangling from the ceremonial sword was a gut punch that solidified Thorne's resolve. "The apprentice dies tonight, Mackenzie," Thorne growled, his voice vibrating with restrained fury. Mackenzie smiled, a cold, dry movement of his lips. "The apprentice is dead, Detective. He died when Chief Riley signed the report on the blackout victim. I am simply the archivist. And tonight, I close the case files." Mackenzie pointed the sword toward a massive, brick incinerator oven that dominated the chamber. The oven door, usually sealed, was slightly ajar. "You wanted the evidence? Look inside the white elephant's tomb, Detective. The chief wanted to burn the proof of his blindness. I merely preserved it." Thorne took a calculated step forward, forcing Mackenzie to slightly shift his weight. "You murdered a frightened boy and 3 innocent people to cover up a decades-old police failure. You're not an archivist, you're a monster." "Innocent?" Mackenzie scoffed, his eyes blazing with a fanatical light. "They were all witnesses. The woman who saw T. Hastings acting strangely near the precinct. The man who recognized the blackout victim's locket. They all saw the truth and did nothing. They became blind in their fear, just like the department. The eyes are taken to prevent the blindness from spreading." Thorne knew arguing was useless. He had to draw the killer into the open. T. Hastings was a witness, Thorne challenged, "and you silenced him too. Why? Because he saw you for the monster you are?" Mackenzie's face contorted in sudden, genuine anger. No. Hastings saw the lie. He just didn't see the cost. When he started talking about revealing the tunnel, he became a threat to the archives. I had to give him the gift of silence permanently, so the truth could live on in the walls. The confession was the opening Thorne needed. As Mackenzie finished speaking, Thorne fired a single, clean shot. The bullet didn't hit Mackenzie. It shattered the single ceiling bulb. Darkness instantly plunged the chamber into absolute blackness. Thorne dropped to one knee, relying on the memory of the room and the sudden, loud clatter of the ceremonial sword dropping to the concrete floor. The light on his gun remained off. He needed to preserve his night vision. Mackenzie screamed, a raw, inhuman sound of panic and rage. "My eyes! My darkness! You blind me! You wanted blindness, Mackenzie? You got it!" Thorne yelled back, his voice echoing. Thorne knew Mackenzie was dependent on the single light to control the scene. Now, the killer was disoriented, forced into the very darkness he preached about. Mackenzie scrabbled on the floor for the sword. Thorne, moving silently, skirted the chamber wall, heading directly for the slightly open incinerator door. He reached the hot, rusting metal and pulled the door open, using his light for a quick, momentary flash. Inside the incinerator, preserved from the heat by a thick layer of asbestos sheeting, was a final, terrible display. It wasn't a body. It was a table of evidence, arranged like a ceremonial altar. The center was a stack of waterlogged, faded police reports, the true, original reports for the blackout victim case, showing it had been a clear homicide, with the name of the true killer scribbled out and replaced with the overdose ruling. A clear, institutional cover-up orchestrated by Chief George Riley, and lying on top of the reports, wrapped in plastic, was the final, devastating piece of evidence, the entire collection of police files and private journals of Officer T. Hastings, meticulously documenting the cover-up and Mackenzie's growing obsession. Thorne grabbed the files and stuffed them into his jacket. The evidence was secured. As he turned, a pale, swift shadow lunged at him. Mackenzie, weaponless, used the darkness he knew so well. He hit Thorne with a desperate, wild tackle, slamming him back against the furnace wall. They struggled, Mackenzie's skeletal fingers clawing for Thorne's eyes, trying to give the detective his final gift. "You saw it. You saw the truth. Now you must be silent," Mackenzie hissed, his breath hot and fetid. Thorne struggled, planting his feet and driving his knee into Mackenzie's gut. The killer gasped and stumbled backward. Thorne flipped on his light, blinding the archivist for a precious second. Mackenzie raised his hands to shield his eyes. "No more blindness," Thorne stated, his voice final. Thorne fired 2 shots. One in the chest, one in the shoulder. Mackenzie didn't scream. He simply stared at the light, the fanaticism slowly draining from his eyes, replaced by a dawning, terrible realization that he collapsed backward, not into the chamber, but into the mouth of the egress tunnel, the tunnel he had used to live and escape through the dark spots of the city. He fell into the darkness he had mastered, closing the final blind spot. Thorne stood over the entrance, listening until the faint sound of the body hitting the water below faded into silence. The official investigation that followed was swift and devastating. The files secured from the incinerator proved the cover-up orchestrated by the late Chief George Riley. Officer T. Hastings was posthumously cleared and recognized as a witness, not a killer. The precinct was condemned and scheduled for demolition. The White Elephant, finally laid to rest. Detective Elias Thorne was hailed a hero, the man who exposed the darkest secrets hidden within the very walls of the police department. But Thorne knew the truth. He had exposed the files, but he hadn't escaped the horror. 1 month later, at the demolished site of the precinct,